The rifle crack echoed across the canyon like thunder, and Sarah Mitchell knew she was going to die. Blood seeped through her fingers as she pressed them against the wound in her shoulder, her horse whinnying in terror beneath her. Through the haze of pain and dust, she saw him, a lone figure standing on the ridge above, his weathered face carved from stone, his long black hair streaked with silver catching the dying light, the last warrior of a people the world had forgotten. And in his dark eyes she saw not the hatred she expected, but something far more devastating: recognition. 27 years earlier. The smoke still rose from the Cheyenne village when Captain William Harrison dismounted his horse, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. November 1864, Sand Creek. The name would haunt him for the rest of his days, though he didn't know it yet. At 26, he was young enough to believe in the righteousness of his cause, and old enough to carry out orders without question. "Sir," Sergeant Mitchell approached, his face pale beneath the grime. "We've counted nearly 200 dead, mostly women and children, sir." Harrison's jaw tightened. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he'd taken the commission. This wasn't war. This was slaughter. But Colonel Chivington's orders had been clear: eliminate the threat, show no mercy. In the midst of the devastation, Harrison saw him for the first time, a young Cheyenne brave, perhaps 18 years old, kneeling beside the body of an elderly woman. The young man's chest rose and fell with silent sobs, his hand gently stroking the woman's gray hair. Harrison raised his rifle, finger poised on the trigger, but something made him hesitate. The brave looked up, and their eyes met across the battlefield. There was no fear in those dark depths, only an unfathomable grief that struck Harrison like a physical blow. The brave slowly stood, his movements fluid despite his obvious wounds. He spoke something in Cheyenne, his voice carrying across the space between them like a prayer or a curse. Then he turned and melted into the trees, leaving Harrison standing there with his unfired weapon and a growing hollow in his chest. "Sir?" Sergeant Mitchell's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Should we pursue?" "No," Harrison said quietly. "Let him go." The years between. William Harrison tried to forget. He married Margaret, his childhood sweetheart, and they moved to Colorado Territory, where he established a successful ranch. He threw himself into building something good, something clean, as if hard work and honest sweat could wash the blood from his hands. Margaret bore him a daughter, Sarah, who grew up wild and free on the ranch, more comfortable in the saddle than in a parlor. But the dreams never stopped. In them he saw those dark eyes filled with grief, heard that voice speaking words he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. Harrison aged quickly, his brown hair going gray at the temples before his 40th birthday, his shoulders carrying a weight that no one else could see. The Cheyenne brave, whose name Harrison learned years later was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom in his mother's tongue, had indeed survived. But survival and living were different things entirely. He watched from the mountains as his people were herded onto reservations, watched as the buffalo disappeared and the rails cut scars across the sacred land. He became a ghost, living alone in the high places, speaking to no one, trusting nothing except the wind and the stars. The soldiers hunted him sporadically over the years, calling him the last wolf for the way he moved unseen through their territory. But he was no wolf. Wolves hunted in packs. He was something else entirely, something that had no name in any language because it shouldn't exist, the sole survivor of a world that had been murdered. Years passed. Harrison's wife died of influenza, leaving him alone with his daughter and his guilt. Sarah grew into a fierce, independent woman who ran the ranch with an iron will and a compassionate heart. She knew her father carried secrets. She could see it in the way he stared out at the mountains, in the way he sometimes whispered apologies to the empty air. The return. In the spring of 1891, Harrison received word that changed everything. A letter from Washington, delivered by a nervous postal clerk, who seemed eager to be away from the ranch as quickly as possible. The government was offering pardons, the letter said. Amnesty for actions taken during the Indian Wars. All they required was a signature, an acknowledgement of service. Harrison read the letter 3 times before burning it in the kitchen stove. Sarah found him there, an hour later, staring at the ashes. "Papa." She knelt beside his chair, her strong hands covering his weathered ones. "What is it?" "I need to make things right, Sarah." His voice was barely a whisper. "Before I die, I need to make things right." Sarah had always known this day would come. She'd seen it in her father's haunted eyes, in the way he sometimes called out names in his sleep, names that sounded like wind through dry grass. She didn't ask what he meant. Instead, she simply said, "Then we'll make it right." It took Harrison 3 months to find him. 3 months of asking questions in trading posts and mining camps, of following rumors and half-remembered stories. The old-timers spoke of him in whispers, the Indian who lived like a spirit in the high country, who could walk on snow without leaving tracks, who could disappear into rock and shadow. Harrison made the journey alone, despite Sarah's protests. Some reckonings, he told her, couldn't be shared. He rode into the mountains with supplies for a week and a heart full of words he'd been rehearsing for 27 years. He found Ayana's camp in a box canyon, hidden behind a waterfall that made music against the stone. It was a simple place, a lean-to shelter, a fire ring, tools and weapons maintained with meticulous care. And there, sitting cross-legged beside the fire as if he'd been waiting, was the man who had haunted Harrison's dreams. Ayana looked up as Harrison approached, and time collapsed between them. The young brave was gone, replaced by a man whose face bore the marks of decades in the wilderness. His hair was completely gray now, braided with feathers and beads. His body was lean and hard, carved by wind and weather into something elemental. But his eyes were exactly the same. "I have been waiting," Ayana said in English, his voice rusty from disuse. Harrison dismounted slowly, his hands trembling. "Waiting for what?" "For you to come." Ayana gestured to a place across the fire. "Sit. We have much to speak of." They sat in silence for a long time, two old men separated by the width of a fire and the breadth of history. Finally, Harrison found his voice. "I came to ask for forgiveness." Ayana studied him for a long moment. "You were there, at Sand Creek." "Yes." "You killed my people." "Yes." The word came out like a breath, like a death rattle. "Your daughter," Ayana said suddenly. "She has your eyes but not your grief." "This is good." Harrison started. "How do you know about Sarah?" "I know many things. I know you have carried this weight for 27 years. I know you have tried to build good things on bad ground. I know you named your daughter for the woman you should have married, not the one you did. How could you possibly?" "Because I have watched." Ayana's voice was quiet, matter of fact. "I have been the shadow at the edge of your life, William Harrison. I have seen your daughter grow strong and brave. I have seen you wake screaming in the night. I have seen you give food to hungry travelers and shelter to lost children. I have seen you try to balance the scales." Harrison felt tears burning his eyes. "It's not enough. It will never be enough." "No," Ayana agreed, "it will not." They fell silent again. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the distance a hawk screamed. Finally, Ayana spoke again. "My grandmother was a medicine woman. She taught me that some wounds are meant to be carried. They remind us who we are, who we have been. But she also taught me that forgiveness is not given, it is found. Like water in the desert, it appears when the seeking becomes more important than the finding. I don't understand." Ayana stood, moving to a leather bag hanging from a tree branch. He withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin, and returned to the fire. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, unwrapping a intricately beaded necklace. "She wore it the day she died at Sand Creek. I took it from her body while you watched." Harrison's breath caught. He remembered, the young brave kneeling beside the elderly woman, the tender gesture of stroking her hair. "She raised me after my parents died of the white man's sickness," Ayana continued. "She taught me the old ways, the stories, the songs. She was the keeper of our people's heart." "I'm sorry," Harrison whispered. "God, I'm so sorry. She told me once that hatred is a fire that burns the one who carries it. She said that someday, a man would come seeking forgiveness, and I would have to choose, feed the fire or let it die." Ayana held up the necklace, its beads catching the firelight like tiny stars. "I choose to let it die." The old soldier and the last warrior sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They shared food and water, and Harrison told Ayana about his life, about Margaret's gentle laugh, about Sarah's fierce independence, about the nights he'd lain awake wondering if he'd earned the right to happiness. In return, Ayana spoke of the mountains, of the seasons turning in their endless cycle, of the animals that had become his companions in the long years of solitude. He spoke of his people's belief that the dead lived on in the wind and the water, in the turning of the earth and the light of the stars. "Your grandmother," Harrison said finally. "What was her name?" "Ayola. It means wind song." "Ayola," Harrison repeated, tasting the syllables. "She would have been proud of you, for choosing forgiveness." "And your daughter would be proud of you," Ayana replied, "for seeking it." The unforeseen. Harrison left the canyon the next morning, with a lighter heart than he'd carried in decades. The meeting with Ayana had given him something he'd never expected to find: peace. He rode home with plans to tell Sarah everything, to finally unburden himself of the secrets he'd carried for so long. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The attack came without warning. 3 men, desperate and mean, who'd been watching the ranch and waiting for their chance. Harrison was still a day's ride from home when he heard the gunshots echoing across the valley. Sarah had fought, that much was clear when Harrison arrived. The ranch house showed signs of a struggle, and one of the attackers lay dead in the yard. But Sarah was gone, and the tracks leading away from the ranch told a grim story. Harrison followed the trail with the skill of a man who'd spent decades in the wilderness. The kidnappers were heading for the high country, probably planning to demand ransom from what they assumed was a wealthy rancher. They had no way of knowing that they'd taken the one thing in the world that mattered more to Harrison than his own life. The pursuit led him higher into the mountains, into country he'd never seen before. He pushed his horse hard, driven by a desperation that made his chest feel like it was going to explode. As the trail wound higher, he began to recognize landmarks from his recent journey to Ayana's camp. That's when he heard the rifle shot. The revelation. Harrison crested the ridge just in time to see Sarah fall from her horse, blood blooming across her shirt. Below them, in a narrow canyon, the 3 kidnappers had made camp. One of them, a big man with a scarred face, was leveling his rifle for another shot when Ayana materialized from the rocks like smoke. What followed was poetry written in violence. Ayana moved with the fluid grace of water, of wind, of something not quite human. His bow sang, and arrows found their marks with deadly precision. Within minutes, all 3 kidnappers lay dead. Harrison scrambled down the slope to where Sarah had fallen, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was conscious but pale, blood seeping through her fingers as she pressed them against the wound in her shoulder. "Papa," she whispered. "I tried to get away. I tried shoo." Harrison gathered her in his arms, his own eyes burning with tears. "You did good, sweetheart. You did so good." Ayana appeared beside them, as if he'd stepped out of thin air. Without a word, he knelt and examined Sarah's wound, his practiced hands gentle and sure. "The bullet passed through," he said quietly. "She will live, but she needs care. There's a doctor in town," Harrison said desperately. "If I can get her there." "Too far. Too much blood lost." Ayana's voice was calm, decisive. "My camp. I have medicine." Harrison looked into those dark eyes, the same ones that had haunted his dreams for nearly 3 decades, and saw only compassion. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you help us?" Ayana's weathered face softened almost imperceptibly. "Because she is yours, and because forgiveness means nothing if it is not lived." They carried Sarah to Ayana's hidden canyon, where the last warrior of the Cheyenne tended her wounds with herbs and skills passed down through generations. For 3 days, Harrison sat by his daughter's side while Ayana worked quietly in the background, brewing teas and changing bandages, his movements as careful and reverent as a prayer. On the 3rd night, as Sarah's fever finally broke, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Ayana. "You're him," she said, her voice weak but certain. "You're the one Papa dreams about." Ayana glanced at Harrison, who nodded slowly. "Yes," the old warrior said, "I am. He talks in his sleep sometimes," Sarah continued. "Says he's sorry. Says he wishes he could take it back." "I know," Ayana said gently. "We have spoken of this." Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. "Papa told me stories about the Indian Wars, but he never told me he was there. Never told me what he did." "Some stories are too heavy for children to carry," Ayana replied. "I'm not a child anymore." Sarah's voice was firm despite her weakness. "And I think I understand now. Why you live alone up here, why Papa has nightmares, what happened between you." The 2 old men watched as this young woman, this bridge between their 2 worlds, processed the weight of history that had shaped both their lives. "My grandmother used to say that the sins of the fathers don't have to become the sins of the children," Sarah said finally, "that each generation gets to choose who they want to be." "Your grandmother was wise," Ayana said. "No," Sarah smiled weakly. "That was your grandmother. Papa told me what she said about forgiveness, about letting the fire die. The choice." As Sarah recovered, something extraordinary began to happen. The 3 people thrown together by tragedy began to form an unlikely family. Harrison found himself talking to Ayana about things he'd never shared with anyone, his fears, his hopes, his deep regret over the chances he'd missed with his wife and daughter. Ayana in turn began to speak of his people, sharing stories and traditions that had lived only in his memory for decades. And Sarah, with the resilience of youth and the wisdom of someone who'd stared death in the face, became the bridge between them. She asked Ayana to teach her about plants and healing, about reading the signs in nature. She listened to his stories with the same rapt attention she'd once given to her father's tales of cattle drives and railroad adventures. "She has the heart of a healer," Ayana told Harrison one evening as they watched Sarah practice identifying medicinal herbs. "Like my grandmother, she has her mother's compassion," Harrison replied, "but her own strength. The 2 are not separate things." 1 month after the attack, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah made an announcement that surprised both men. "I want to stay," she said simply. "Here, with both of you." Harrison started to protest. "Sarah, you have a life back at the ranch, your future." "My future is here," she said firmly. "Papa, you've spent 27 years carrying guilt that was eating you alive. And Ayana, you've spent the same years carrying grief that was doing the same thing. But look at what happened when you came together. Look at what forgiveness created." She gestured around the canyon, which had transformed over the past month from a hermit's retreat into something warmer, more alive. We could build something here, something good. We could help people, travelers who get lost in the mountains, settlers who need healing, anyone who needs a place to belong. It would be hard, Harrison said quietly. Living up here, away from civilization. Civilization, Sarah laughed, but there was no mockery in it. Papa, what I've seen here in the past month, two enemies becoming family, old wounds finally healing, wisdom being passed down instead of buried. This is civilization. This is what the world should be. Ayanna was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Finally he spoke. My grandmother always said that the earth would heal if people learned to live with it instead of against it, that different tribes could share the same land if they remembered they were all children of the same sky. Then let's try, Sarah said. Let's be the proof that she was right. The new beginning. They stayed. Harrison sold the ranch and used the money to buy supplies and materials. Through the long winter, they built a proper cabin, weatherproofed and warm. Ayanna taught them both the skills they'd need to survive in the high country, how to read weather patterns, how to preserve food, how to live in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world. In spring, word began to spread. Travelers spoke of a place in the mountains where a former soldier, a Cheyenne medicine man, and a strong-willed woman offered shelter and healing to anyone in need. Some came skeptically, others desperately, but all found the same thing, a sanctuary, where old enemies had become family, where the past had been acknowledged but not allowed to poison the future. Sarah proved to have a natural gift for healing, combining her father's practical knowledge with Ayanna's traditional medicine. Harrison used his military experience to help lost travelers navigate the treacherous mountain passes. And Ayanna, for the first time in decades, began to teach again, passing on the stories and skills of his people to anyone willing to learn. Years passed. The little sanctuary in the mountains became a legend of sorts, a place where miracles happened not through divine intervention but through the simple power of human connection. People came from hundreds of miles away, drawn by stories of the unlikely family that had chosen love over hatred, healing over revenge, the legacy. On a crisp autumn morning, 15 years after Sarah had been shot in these very mountains, she stood beside Ayanna's bedside and held his weathered hand. He was dying, peacefully, surrounded by the makeshift family he'd never expected to have, and his eyes held the same deep wisdom they'd carried since Harrison first saw them across a battlefield 50 years ago. Ayola, he whispered, and Sarah knew he was seeing his grandmother in the space between worlds. Ayola, I kept the promise. I let the fire die. Harrison, now an old man himself, sat on the other side of the bed. His hair was white as snow, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were clear and free of the haunted shadows that had once filled them. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything, for forgiveness, for family, for showing us that love is stronger than history. Ayanna's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. The circle, he breathed, the sacred circle, it is complete. He died, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah and Harrison sat with him through the night, sharing stories and memories, grieving not just for the man they'd lost, but for the world that had lost its last living link to a vanished people. They buried him according to Cheyenne tradition, in a place where the wind could sing through the trees and carry his spirit home. As they stood by the grave, Sarah spoke the words that would become the motto of their sanctuary. Love transcends all boundaries of race, of time, of the wounds we carry. It asks only that we choose it, again and again over the easier path of hatred and fear. Epilogue, the truth revealed. 20 years later, when Sarah was an old woman herself, and the sanctuary had become a legendary place of healing visited by people from across the continent, she sat down to write the true story of what had happened in these mountains. It was then in the quiet of the evening, as she prepared to record the tale for posterity, that she realized the greatest truth of all. Her father had never told her the complete story of that day at Sand Creek. In all their years together, in all their conversations about forgiveness and redemption, he'd left out one crucial detail. It wasn't until she found his private journal after his death that she learned what had really happened on that bloody November morning in 1864. William Harrison hadn't just witnessed the massacre at Sand Creek. He'd been ordered to participate. But when he'd seen the young Cheyenne brave kneeling beside his grandmother's body, when their eyes had met across the battlefield, Harrison had made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He'd lowered his rifle. He'd let Ayanna escape. And then, in an act of defiance that could have cost him his military career, he'd helped 24 other survivors slip away into the woods. The guilt he'd carried wasn't just for being present at a massacre. It was for not being able to save them all. And Ayanna, he'd known, had always known. That's why he'd been waiting in the mountains all those years. Not for an enemy seeking forgiveness, but for the man who had already given it in the only way that mattered, by choosing compassion over orders, by choosing to save rather than destroy. The recognition in Ayanna's eyes that first day hadn't been hatred at all. It had been gratitude, a gratitude too deep for words, carried across decades, waiting for the right moment to bloom into the kind of love that truly does transcend all boundaries. Sarah smiled as she closed the journal, understanding finally why two old warriors had found peace so easily in each other's presence. Their story wasn't one of forgiveness earned, but of love recognized, love that had been there from the very beginning, waiting patiently through all the years of separation and sorrow for its moment to transform the world. In the end, that's what love does. It waits, it endures, and when we're finally ready to see it, it reveals that we've been connected all along, not by the wounds we've inflicted or the pain we've carried, but by the choice to be better than our worst moments, to be the bridge between what was and what could be, to be the proof that even in a world marked by violence and division, there remains something sacred and unbreakable in the human heart. The sanctuary in the mountains stands to this day, tended now by the children and grandchildren of those who found healing there. Above the door, carved in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Cheyenne, are the words that Sarah wrote on that long-ago evening. Love transcends all boundaries. Choose it. And in the wind that sings through the canyon, visitors sometimes say they can hear voices, an old soldier, a last warrior, and the woman who became the bridge between them, still teaching the world that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see the humanity in those we've been taught to fear.